Hi everyone, my name is Carly and I'm coming from you from my office at Farmingdale State College right now. And one of the things that I've been tapped to talk to you guys about is comics in the classroom. So I was featured on the Tea for Teaching podcast as someone who makes comics in the classroom and has a lot of experience with incorporating comics. And so that's just something I'm going to try to briefly bring to you guys today here. I just got back from the field in Puerto Rico after a week of field collecting, so this probably isn't going to be my most polished presentation, but this is kind of meant to be more of a casual conversation about comics, how you can use them in the classroom, and how you might be able to make your own. So just to give you kind of a breakdown of what we're going to cover in the talk today, first, we're certainly going to talk about why you might consider comics in your classroom, whatever type of classroom that is, whether you're in history or the arts or the sciences or the social studies. And we're going to talk about examples of comics in different disciplines. Now, some of you might have a fairly constricted idea of what a comic means, and I'm hoping that I can sort of break that mold and show you all the different ways that comics have been used, not really as a genre in of itself, but just a medium of making art, of making books, rather. And then we'll talk about how you can incorporate those comics into your classroom and the resources that exist out there, and talk about some of the different comics that there are. And then finally, we'll talk very, very, very briefly about making comics for your class, whether it's designing those comics yourself and using them in coordination with an artist that can help you draw them, or whether or not you're going to draw them yourself. And we'll talk about what you can do if you're not the most artistically inclined person. So a little bit about me, I've been drawing comics ever since I was an undergraduate, and actually technically since I was a high schooler, but I've been drawing comics specifically as a form of science communication since I was an undergraduate, and developing that far more into my graduate degree at the American Museum of Natural History. So what you're looking at here is a few examples of how I've drawn myself over the past few years, from the very start of my grad degree all the way through my professorship here at Farmingdale State College. So yeah, I've acted as a narrator in most of the comics that I've drawn, mostly because I'm using these comics as a tool for science communication and science education. Now, when I moved to Farmingdale, I had to consider, I'm not really making comics so much for science communication. So prior to having a job as a professor, as a grad student and a visiting assistant, I was considering comics more as a tool for talking about science communication, either to the general public or to children, largely middle and elementary school children. But when I started working professionally as an educator at a college, I had to think about how do I translate this really useful tool for science communication and outreach to the general public to something that can be in a formal class setting. So at that point, sort of in this past year or so, I've been thinking more about comics in the college classroom, which is really what I'm here to talk to you about. If you want to know about comics as educational outreach, if you work with the public, if you work with high school or middle schools or elementary schools and you do outreach with your university, with those venues, I'd be happy to talk to you about that. But today's short little talk is going to focus more about bringing comics to your college level classroom. So like I said, comics, they're a really, really, really great tool for scientific outreach. You have the ability to sort of incorporate pop culture into science communication. And generally what we find is that kids like to read them more than they do, regular textbook. But the question ultimately becomes, how do I incorporate this into the actual college classroom? So just a quick question for you guys. You might have to turn on your microphones for this, but when you think of comics, what is the first thing that generally comes to your mind? Maybe you guys can open the chat. I'm not really sure how this works.
Bright colors, laughter, humor.
Okay, you got humor comics, certainly, like things like Peanuts. What else?
Is this working?
Yeah, it's working.
Okay.
You have to turn off your microphones, or turn on your microphones, but it should be able to work. So are you Jessica or Laura?
Just double check before I get this going to un momento. Let's find your screen back here.
How about you, John? What were your perceptions of comics? Oh, someone wrote superheroes. Okay, so that's Vincent. Vincent wrote superheroes. Yeah, lots of superhero comics. How about you, John? Did you have any sort of preconceived notions about comics?
Imagery? Well, or you can always type in the chat. You mentioned that you don't have a webcam, so feel free to type in there and we'll keep monitoring it.
Yeah, so we have someone write Mario, we have someone write superheroes, we've had someone already mention lots of color and humor, and largely what most people think of when they think comics is superhero comics. So, oh, unfortunately, my animations aren't working that great on my end. Oh, there we go.
And
So
Laura just mentioned the Big Bang Theory and Comic-Con.
yeah, so sorry on my end, the animations on my PowerPoint seem to be lagging with this, but like what most people tend to think of is stuff like this. They think of superhero comics, especially with the rise of the fairly popular Marvel and DC superhero movies that are based on those comics. But comics also include some fairly heavy topics like Art Spiegelman's Mouse, and blue is the warmest color. So those are equally considered comics. So people tend to draw this distinction between comics and graphic novels, but in reality, comics are really any set of sequential images. So traditionally, people would refer to comics as things like superhero comics, and then starting in the 80s and 90s, this term called the graphic novel was introduced. And graphic novels were mostly just a marketing ploy to bring in what were considered more mature readers, things that were reading serious topics like historical fiction, as with Mouse, topics like LGBTQ issues and things like that. So really, this distinction between graphic novels and comics isn't really a true thing. And really, for this talk, I'm mostly going to talk about comics, including both of these sort of different things. So for those of you who want to know a little bit more about what comics are actually, one of the sort of great scholars on comics is this guy named Scott McCloud. And so what Scott McCloud gives as a functional definition of comics is that they are juxtaposed pictorial and other images in deliberate sequence intended to convey information and or produce an aesthetic response in the viewer. So really what McCloud is saying here is that anytime you have a series of images that could have words that actually present a narrative that conveys some sort of information, that's a comic. So really, that's what we're looking at here. Sort of one of the sort of major scholars in comics right now and understanding what comics are is this guy named Scott McCloud. And he gives this sort of very, very, very broad, but useful in its broadness, sort of definition of what a comic is. And that is juxtaposed pictorial and other images in deliberate sequence intended to convey information and or produce an aesthetic response in the viewer. So what McCloud is saying here is that anytime that you have photos that are sort of, or illustrations, any sort of drawn information or visual information where they are proceeding in some sort of sequence where there's a clear start and an end, even if it's just a comic strip or a couple of panels or something more elaborate like a whole page or multiple pages in a sequence that are conveying some sort of information, whether it's concrete information like a plot or even just emotional information, that's a comic. So what I'm getting at with this is that comics aren't just about superheroes or about topics that your kid might want to read. In fact, comics themselves are just a medium, and they can cover topics that range certainly from superheroes, but all the way through drama, social studies issues, historical issues, science topics, mathematic topics. Really, comics are just another way of explaining information that rely on this tying together of visual information and written information, not just a genre that focus on a very, very narrow range of topics. So one good example of this is this comic drawn by Jay Hostler, who is also a professor of biology at Juniata College. He, like me, is also an entomologist, and he's published with major companies, basically making educational biology comics. His most recent comic was called Last of the Sandwalkers, and it's a really interesting comic that creates these obviously anthropomorphized insect characters. They're actually all beetles, but gives them sort of storylines and plots that actually still have the effect of educating students about sort of topics in entomology and biology and the scientific process. And you can see down here that this is actually the organism that the main character Lucy is based upon. And you can see it's still fairly accurate. You're still passing on useful information about the biology of these animals, even when you're anthropomorphizing them. So giving a story to go along with the information that you're trying to portray isn't something that subtracts from the information you're trying to teach, but can actually add to it. And so this is just a really nice spread from that same comic. Again, you can see all of the beetles. They're all rather small in comparison to the thing that's attacking them, this big bird. And you're getting a sense of sort of them trying to escape this predator. So again, it's humorous. You know, it's obviously anthropomorphizing the characters, but there's actually a lot of useful, accurate biological information that's going along with this topic. So when you incorporate comics, you're obviously combining words and images. And for me as a biology professor, this becomes particularly useful because you can explain these really, really difficult concepts that require multiple steps. So anyone who's taken a basic biology class has had to learn about the Krebs cycle at some point. Basically, this process by which your body takes things like sugars and produces adenosine triphosphate, the sort of cellular energy that you need for all of the processes that your cells are going to go through. And this is clearly one of the most difficult things to learn about for any general biology student. But you can see in this diagram here, basically this comic here, that Jay has drawn this really, really useful visualization of what is typically considered a fairly difficult topic in introductory biology. I do the same thing with systematics and evolutionary biology, especially when I'm trying to portray things that often rely on diagrams in the first place. So when you learn evolutionary biology and you learn things that require an understanding of phylogenetic trees and evolutionary history, it's nice to have visualizations to go along with these kind of dense explanations. So you can take these traditionally difficult concepts in whatever your field is and incorporate them through a narration of images instead of just text by itself. And this has been shown to help students understand these relatively difficult concepts. The nice thing about comics too is that they provide a break from lectures and textbooks. So I could give information in a textbook, sure. I can give large blocks of information, or I can choose to break up those large blocks of information and draw them into concise images that share the same information equally. Now, I'm not saying that comics should replace every single textbook that's ever existed. What I am saying is that they provide a sort of nice palate cleanser to sort of the traditional textbooks that we've typically always have used. And then particularly for me, one of the reasons that I like using comics is that they sort of give me a venue in which I can explore increasing diversity in my field, which is biology. So there are lots of comics out there that specifically utilize underrepresented minorities as narrators or as main characters to sort of increase diversity in our own fields. This is a major issue in biology and STEM fields right now, and it's certainly something that's being explored through comic venues, especially those that are meant for a younger audience. But I think you can bring that same concept to college level, especially, you know, in courses where you want your students to see themselves as biologists or as historians or as writers. So the comics that I generally focus on right now are making comics for my own classroom. I teach non-major biology, which means for many of my students, they haven't taken a science course since maybe environmental science in high school and things like that. So for me, I make comics that explain sort of basic topics in biology. So this right here is an introduction to homology, the concept that there are shared traits due to common ancestry. And it's sort of one of the basic principles that you learn about when you learn about evolution for the first time. And so in this comic, I'm the narrator, and I'm bringing in sort of a humorous situation of suddenly having all of these different tetrapods, these organisms that are descended from a common ancestor that had 4 limbs, to sort of talk about what a homology is and sort of where you see these homologies in the fossil record and today's organisms today. And sort of the project that I'm working on sort of long-term is doing this, but for an entire textbook. So previously I had made comics that just explained simple concepts, that were just sort of, single ideas. Like the homology comic is only about 6 pages. But what I'm trying to do right now is actually make an entire textbook that is going to either act as a supplement to professors who are already using a regular textbook, but can also be used on its own without any traditional textbook. So it's going to cover the same topics that you would find in any sort of non-major biology course, like talking about what science is, what the scientific method is, talking about atoms, electrons, and protons, talking about the major macromolecules, all the way continuing through cellular biology, genetics, reproduction, ecology, and evolution. So that's my major project right now while I'm at Farmingdale State College, is to work on producing this comic and then putting it online as an open educational resource for other professors to use outside of my class. And this is just to show you how complicated you can get with comics if you want. So in these last few examples, I was showing you some undergraduate level comics that are designed for your typical college class, but there actually have been comics that have taken it much heavier. So this is Nick Susanis's work. And what he has done here, he sort of studies the neurology of visualization and writing. And this is his entire dissertation. His dissertation is literally a comic. So just to show you just how complicated you can get in your ideas, this is just one example. So I've sort of showed you why comics should be considered. I've given you some examples of what those comics could look like. I've hopefully broadened your idea about what is part of comics, but it's also good to have research about this stuff. Who is actually studying the impacts that comics could have in the classroom, especially if you're still debating about whether or not you want to have these comics. So these are just a list of some of the research that's been covered. And what we ultimately find is that there's lots of research showing that comics increase sort of the attitudes that students have towards the topics they're learning. So Hostler and Boomer and Spiegel et al., they showed that students, especially those who did not identify as science people or didn't see themselves as scientifically proficient, when they studied from the comics that were created for that class, they felt more positively towards the material. And feeling more positively towards the material is often, half the battle we teach, sort of with getting our students engaged. So if the students feel better about the material and they feel more connected to it, there's a higher likelihood that they're going to study. Now, unfortunately, there's not a lot of research that actually examines sort of the impacts that comics have on performance. Yeah, there's a lot showing that attitudes increase, but there actually aren't a lot of papers out there that show how much do students do better, how much do we see a increase in test performance and things like that. So that's one of the reasons I'm trying to convince more professors to use comics, is that with more professors using comics, we'll have more pedagogical research that shows how the comics are successful. And hopefully that involves, getting more people to use the comics and getting more funding agencies like the NSF to start considering comics as a valid educational resource material, not just for the public, but also for our formal education purposes. So if you're thinking about incorporating comics into your curriculum, I'm not by any means the first person to have done that. There's actually several books out there, these are the ones listed here, that actually talk about what to look for when you're trying to, say, replace one of your assigned readings with a comic or a graphic novel. So that's really what I want to convince people who might be watching this presentation to do. You probably have a list of assigned readings, especially if you're in the histories or the social studies or the liberal arts. And what I would say to you is that there's probably at least one example of a comic book that you can incorporate into your class. So This is meant to be a discussion break, but unfortunately we don't have a lot of people in here. So one of the questions I would challenge you to ask yourself when you're listening to this presentation is, what do you look for in assigned books, and how do you usually incorporate them? You probably incorporate them by having assignments, having essays your students have to write, having discussions that your students have to engage in. And then you probably have a few examples of books that you already have on your curriculum because you presumably have been teaching this course for a while. What I would actually say to you at this point is, again, there's probably a comic book that would easily fit into your curriculum, and again, would provide your students with sort of a break from traditional readings. So, for example, there are lots and lots of history graphic novels or comics that have become rather famous in the publishing world. You know, things like March, which covers the civil rights movements, or things like Jen Luen Yang's sort of memoir about the immigrant experience in America would be very, very fitting for some of your classes. And these are just some more things from him, more historical fiction following the Boxer Rebellion. So this is actually a really good perspective on what do two sides of a war look like. So he actually is probably a great author to consider if you teach any sort of history or social studies class. On my end, as someone who is in one of these STEM fields, there's actually a lot of guidebooks that utilize comics to explain these ideas. Again, this is taking advantage of that idea that when you are explaining information that often relies on diagrams and series of images and steps anyways, you could always use a comic in the place of just having captioned images. So the manga guides and the cartoon guides are actually a really good example of how you can use comics in any of the science, technology, engineering, or mathematic fields. And then if you're looking for any more resources for finding those comics for your class, let's say you teach a very specific topic, you're not really sure what you should incorporate because you're not a big comic book reader yourself, there's actually plenty of resources online that are like, oh, you teach this topic, here's a comic for you. And so really explore these sort of with the same seriousness that you explore anytime that you're trying to figure out a book to incorporate into your class. What I would say is that comic publishing has become so diverse in the past 20 years that you're probably going to find something that's fairly relevant to a portion of the class that you're trying to teach. So again, this was more sort of discussion, more things for you to consider, but again, all of it adding up to the idea of, can you find a graphic novel for your course? If you're having issues doing this, and if you're hitting a wall when you're trying to search this online, feel free to contact me. I read a lot of comics, and I can probably find you a graphic novel that's going to suit the needs of your class with a little bit of searching. So this is sort of just kind of a last bit of information about comics. So let's say you're hearing this talk and you're like, I really want to develop comics specifically for my course. I don't want to rely on other publications, but I want to produce those comics myself, maybe put them up online as an OER material. So if you're interested in developing your own comics, I would say don't work in a vacuum for this. There are lots of people at your institution that are probably have some experience in helping you make comics. So the slide you see here and the images you see here was back from the days when I was thinking about comics as sort of an educational outreach material for children and the public, but the same ideas still hold. So if you're a biologist, if you're a historian, if you work in the social studies, you probably want to consider teaming up with someone that works in the teaching department or the education department, someone who does a lot of pedagogy research about what is successful and what isn't successful. You might also consider working with your university's PR department or with any sort of teacher relationships that your university has with the local schools around it. My point being is that if it's your first time making a comic, you probably want to reach out to people who have experience in sort of educational tools. You want to communicate with those people and ask them for their advice. So again, when I was making comics as a grad student, it was really, really helpful to sort of have people I could bounce ideas off of. So when I was working at the AMNH, the Museum of Natural History, there were actually educational outreach coordinators that I could bounce ideas off of, and I didn't have to just sit with my ideas in a vacuum, but I can work with others. Sort of on the college end of things, this is where you might want to consider contacting editors and contacting your librarians and getting sort of advice from people who actually have to review these materials. Is the material you're producing up to the same sort of level that those librarians would consider before putting it into their collections? And then, of course, the trick to any good comic is to actually plan it, and to plan it in extreme amounts of detail. You're going to work yourself into a wall if you actually just start drawing the comic. So consider making a scripting process, thumbnailing, writing out outlines and details and everything that you might need to make your comic successful. So even before you actually begin drawing the thing, you should have pages and pages of information for you to actually start reviewing well in advance of actually making the comic. And then you actually, once you have that script, you have to ask yourself, is your script appropriate to your class? So I teach general biology for non-majors, and sort of one of the things I always have to consider is that my students aren't coming in with the same background knowledge that maybe biology students in a biology majors class might have. So this is where it's good to actually bounce ideas off of your colleagues, people who might have a better reckoning about what the student population actually is. If you're a person like me who's teaching non-majors, then I have to consider my university as a whole and not just students that might be within my department. And so once you have sort of these ideas about, is your script appropriate? Do you have the right resources? Are you covering the right topics? You can play with more difficult questions about how cartoony do you want to be? So again, this is where you consider things that like, are you just presenting non-fictional material? Are you just presenting facts? Are you going to add a story the way that Jay Hostler does? And so asking questions like how cartoony do you want to get and how accurate do you want to get are really important. And again, this is all based on the idea of what level is your class at. Are these introductory students that are coming straight from high school, or are these students that are in sort of their fourth year and have been exposed to fairly in-depth concepts already and might feel a little bit, insulted by something that was super cartoony? And then this is sort of something that I considered when I was working as an outreach coordinator, is my comic actually helpful to other educators? So for me, this is particularly important because I'm producing an open educational resource. So it's not just something that I'm going to use in my classroom, but it's also going to be something that I convince other educators and other professors to use. And so what we learned on an earlier project called the Myrmex Anthology, which is an anthology about ants, is that we couldn't just make the comic. We actually had to provide lesson plans, assignments, assessment. This image here is clearly showing school children, but the same thing follows if you're making an OER for college classrooms. You can't just present your comic alone as an island. You actually have to give assessment materials, test questions, essay prompts, things that will actually help other professors to incorporate your comic into their curriculum. And this is true whether you're doing an entire textbook like I am, or whether you're just doing a small, singular 10-page concept-based comic. There should be some materials that help others assess whether that comic is actually teaching the students any information. So finally, you want to make that comic. If you are not the type of person that likes to draw, you can hire an artist. But I would emphasize that whenever you hire an artist, you should pay them. You should compensate them for their efforts. No one likes hearing the excuse that they're just going to get exposure and that's going to add to their CV. So I would say at the very least, if you're going to use a student, you need to be giving them college credit that actually works to their degree if they're an art student. But even better would be doing that and paying them for their efforts. And there's lots of resources online to show you sort of what the standard pay rate is per page for illustrators at a variety of levels. But let's say you don't have the resources to pay anyone. I would say that you don't actually have to be all that great at drawing to actually make a successful comic. So XKCD is sort of one of the famous science communication comics that are out there. And the thing is entirely drawn in stick figures. And some of the most amusing comics don't have the best technical art skills. So I would say, try drawing it yourself if you have to, and don't get too caught up sort of in the technical details of how good your illustrations are. All right, that's it for me.